She taped the notice to my door at 6 a.m. Bold red letters, eviction proceedings initiated. My 3 hens clucked softly behind me, clueless they were illegal livestock. Karen, head of the HOA board, smirked from her porch. But what she didn't know? I'm the one who decides what counts as livestock in this state. My name's Lena Matthews. I'm 44 years old, and for the past 12 years, I've lived on a half-acre plot just outside Dover, Delaware, the kind of quiet corner where you can hear the sunrise before you see it. My 3 hens, Ruby, Dot, and Marigold, aren't just livestock. They're part of my morning. I sip coffee while they scratch the soil. I collect their eggs before heading to work. I talk to them like they're old friends because in some ways, they are. I started keeping hens after my mother passed away. She grew up on a farm, and those chickens were my way of staying connected. To her, to the land, to something real in a world that moves too fast. So when Karen Hollis, the HOA president, decided my girls were a code violation and sent an eviction notice to my door, it wasn't just about birds. It was about grief. It was about dignity. It was about holding on to something small that gave me peace. And what Karen didn't know, what she never bothered to ask, is that I'm the director of agricultural licensing for the state of Delaware. I helped draft the very rules she tried to weaponize against me. This wasn't just petty, it was personal. And if you've ever fought for something small, something that meant everything, you'll understand what came next. Where are you watching from, and what's one thing you'd never give up, no matter how many people told you it wasn't allowed? Stick with me, because what started with 3 hens turned into something much bigger. Act 1. The peaceful start. You could hear the peace out here. Every morning I'd wake just before the sun crested over the tall pines on the edge of our neighborhood. The air was thick with dew, the kind that settles like a whisper on the porch railings. And before I even poured my coffee, I'd slide open the screen door and listen for them. Ruby, Dot, and Marigold. 3 hens. Not loud, not messy, not rebellious, just present. I got them 2 years ago after my mother passed. She'd grown up on a working farm outside Harrington, and she used to say there was no better way to center your life than to care for something small every day. I guess I didn't fully understand what she meant until I was standing in her empty kitchen, sorting through tea tins and threadbare dish towels, and found a photo of her with a hen in her arms and a smile that reached all the way to her eyes. So, I bought a small prefab coop, painted it robin's egg blue, and named the hens after her favorite garden flowers. Ruby was the bold one, always first out of the gate. Dot was shy and sweet, trailing behind the others like a child on the first day of school. Marigold. Marigold was the troublemaker. If one of them was going to find a way under the fence, it was her. But they gave me something to come home to, something to care for. My job, as the Director of Agricultural Licensing for the state of Delaware, is filled with rules, inspections, debates over zoning and urban farming. I love it. But it's technical, paper-heavy, political. Coming home to those girls reminded me why the work mattered in the first place. Our neighborhood wasn't rural, but it wasn't urban either. Stony Brook Common sat on the edge of town, just 40 homes, wide lots, big trees, and a quiet sense of order. The kind of place where people said good morning, waved while wheeling their trash bins down the driveway, and borrowed cups of sugar, even when they didn't need it. There were gardens in the backyards, raised beds bursting with tomatoes and zucchini, wind chimes, solar lights. One guy, Mr. Pritchard, had a koi pond he treated like royalty. On weekends, people barbecued and kids biked up and down the cul-de-sacs. There was a monthly potluck in the little gazebo by the playground, and a book exchange shelf outside the HOA clubhouse, though no one ever seemed to return the thrillers. It was nice, gentle. Even Karen Hollis, our HOA president, seemed perfectly pleasant at first. She was the type who always wore tennis skirts even though no one had seen her hold a racket in 5 years. She brought lemon squares to the potlucks and complimented my chicken coop during the summer garden walkabout. Said it was charming and very Joanna Gaines. She even took a picture of it once and said she might try something similar if it's allowed. I laughed at the time, didn't think anything of it. Karen had been on the HOA board for 8 years, and she ran it like she ran her garage sales, with color-coded binders and zero tolerance for mess. But I wasn't making mess. I'd made sure of that. I checked the HOA bylaws before I brought the hens in. Nothing in there about chickens, not a single clause. I even called the city's zoning office to make sure our lot size and enclosure met municipal code. They told me backyard hens were permitted as long as there were no roosters and the coop was cleaned regularly. I followed every rule, overbuilt the fence, installed a noise buffer with decorative lattice, used odor-absorbing pine shavings in the coop. You could stand 10 feet away and never know there were chickens behind the garden gate. That fall, the neighborhood kids came over to meet them. I gave out eggs in brown paper cartons with little handwritten notes. Fresh from Ruby Friends, enjoy. It became a thing. People would return the cartons with thank you notes. Some of the older neighbors said it reminded them of their childhoods. There was even talk of starting a community garden in the unused field behind the mailboxes. Karen supported it, or said she did. The peace was real, and I didn't realize how fragile it was. The first crack came in early March, after a surprise thaw. I found a small note folded and left under my windshield wiper while I was parked in my own driveway. Chickens? Really? This isn't a farm. Please consider your neighbors. No name, no signature, no fingerprints. Though I did check, because old habits die hard. I remember looking around the street. Every driveway was empty. No kids biking, no open garage doors. Just wind through the trees and the slow shifting of something I couldn't yet name. I shrugged it off, told myself it wasn't a big deal. But the next week, someone turned over one of my flower pots. Then my garbage bin was accidentally left open during pickup and raccoons got into the compost. Then my Amazon delivery was marked delivered, but never showed. Little things, not enough to call it a pattern, but enough to feel the silence shift. At the next HOA meeting, Karen opened with a line that sounded friendly but stung just beneath the surface. Before we begin, just a gentle reminder that all structures and uses should align with the aesthetic and community standards of Stony Brook Commons. That includes unsanctioned animal enclosures or non-traditional livestock, of course. She didn't look at me when she said it, but everyone else did. Still, I gave her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe it wasn't about me. Maybe there had been a complaint elsewhere. I could be paranoid. After all, I worked in enforcement. I knew how often people assumed things were personal when they weren't, but I also knew the most efficient takedowns often start with smiles. And what I didn't know, what I couldn't have known that morning as I stood barefoot on my porch watching Ruby flap her wings like she ruled the roost, was that the storm was already rolling in. Quiet at first, like all storms are. But it would not stay quiet for long. Act 2. Karen appears. Quiet at first, like all storms are, but it would not stay quiet for long. 2 weeks after that HOA meeting, where Karen first made her thinly veiled announcement, I received my first formal notice. It arrived in a white envelope with HOA compliance review, printed at the top in that faux cursive font Karen loved for community newsletters. Inside was a single-page letter, clean, cold, labeled, Notice of Potential Violation. We have received reports that livestock, specifically chickens, are being kept on your property at 38 Sycamore Lane in potential violation of HOA Section 14B Unauthorized Animals and Structures. Please provide written clarification or remove said livestock within 7 days to avoid escalation. There were no details, no actual bylaw references that cited chickens directly, just vague terms, livestock, potential violation, like shadows on a wall. I stared at that paper for a long time. Then I pulled out the HOA's charter from the drawer where I kept my work files. I'd read it front to back before ever setting up the coop. There was nothing in there. No clause about hens, no restrictions on enclosures as long as they were under 6 feet and behind the primary dwelling. The word livestock was mentioned once in reference to commercial boarding or breeding, in which clearly didn't apply to 3 hens and a hobbyist garden. Still, I decided to respond respectfully. I typed a reply, included photos of the coop, listed the city code by number, and enclosed documentation from the Delaware Department of Agriculture, which, yes, bore my signature. I even attached a notarized map showing my property boundaries, setbacks, and the location of the coop relative to all other homes. I mailed it the same day. 3 days later, I got a knock on the door. It was Karen. Hair blown out into her usual side-swept bob, clipboard in hand, HOA lanyard around her neck like a badge of office. She didn't smile. "Hi, Lena," she said. "Morning, Karen," I replied, neutral. "I wanted to follow up personally. Some of the board members are concerned your chickens may set a precedent. We've already had 2 other residents ask if they can keep goats." I blinked. Goats? She nodded. We're just trying to maintain the neighborhood's character. I gestured toward the coop, clean and discreet behind my garden. I don't think Ruby, Dot, and Marigold are threatening anyone's character. Karen glanced toward the hens but didn't move closer. Still, it's important we're consistent. The board will be holding a vote on whether backyard fowl constitute a breach of Section 14B. If it passes, we'll be issuing formal orders. That bylaw doesn't apply, I said calmly. She didn't flinch. We'll see how the vote goes. And then she left. That's when I knew this wasn't about the chickens. Not really. It was about control, about someone like Karen, who had run every garage sale, bake sale, and flower sale this community ever held, deciding that she didn't like the image of a woman with dirt under her nails and feathers in her backyard. Over the next week, small things started happening again. First came the Facebook posts. Karen made a vague post on the neighborhood group. Do we really want our beautiful community turned into a barnyard? Property values matter. Let's protect them. The comments rolled in. Some agreed, others didn't, but Karen liked everyone that mentioned health concerns, smells, or childhood safety, even though there had never been a complaint or incident. Even though my hens were vaccinated, clean, and better behaved than some of the dogs in the subdivision. Then came the whispers. I'd pass by neighbors on walks, people I used to chat with, and their greetings were cooler. Some avoided eye contact altogether. At the community cleanup, no one took eggs from the donation basket I'd brought, even though they always disappeared before. And then, late one night, I saw two teenage boys jump the back fence, throw something into the coop, and run. I raced outside, flashlight in hand, and found a handful of firecrackers, unlit, but meant to scare. My hens were rattled for days. Ruby stopped laying altogether. I didn't call the police. Instead, I installed cameras, quietly. I emailed Karen again, asked if the HOA had any security footage from the gazebo path or the west fence. She replied, "Unfortunately, our community security system is limited. We recommend residents install private surveillance if needed. No apology, no concern." The following Tuesday, I attended the HOA board meeting in person. The room was stuffy, and the long table at the front was set like a courtroom. Karen sat in the center, flanked by her usual two allies, Mark Thompson, who never spoke unless Karen gave him a cue, and Lydia Crane, whose job seemed to be passing out copies of everything with color-coded sticky notes. I came prepared. I brought documentation, photos, printed ordinances. I waited as they worked through budget notes, landscaping approvals, and a bizarre debate about mailbox uniformity. Then Karen cleared her throat. Next item, animal containment and its impact on neighborhood standards. As you all know, we've had recent concerns about backyard livestock creating divisiveness and health questions in our community. I move that we interpret Section 14B to prohibit the keeping of all poultry within Stony Brook Commons. She smiled sweetly at the room. This would allow us to maintain a consistent policy and avoid future escalation. I raised my hand. Karen blinked. This is a board vote, Lena. I understand, but may I speak during the community comments portion? She hesitated. 3 minutes. I stood, walked to the front, placed my file on the table. I am a resident of 38 Sycamore Lane. I am also the Director of Agricultural Licensing for the state of Delaware. I can confirm there are no state or city prohibitions on keeping a limited number of hens for personal use. Our neighborhood charter has no such clause either. In fact, no changes to the charter can be made without a community-wide vote and a 2/3 majority. The room shifted. I continued. And just so we're clear, redefining bylaws without proper vote is not just unethical. It's legally challengeable. Karen didn't respond. But Lydia stopped taking notes. These hens are not a nuisance. They are clean, vaccinated, and penned. I have followed every letter of the law. If there is a health concern, I am happy to provide certification. But if this is personal, if this is about optics, then it's not about chickens. It's about control. Silence. Then Mark mumbled, "We can table this until next month." Karen's jaw tightened, but she nodded. Fine. Motion tabled. But I could see it in her eyes. This wasn't over. She had started something, and she wasn't going to stop until either my girls were gone, or she was. Karen didn't come for me right away. After the board meeting, things went quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, the other kind, the kind you hear just before something breaks, like the air's gone heavy with pressure, and even the birds forget how to sing. For about a week, I let myself believe she'd backed off, that maybe my speech, my credentials, the law, something had done the trick. But then the letters started. Not official HOA letters, anonymous ones, folded into unsealed envelopes, left in my mailbox, slid under my welcome mat, taped to my coop fence. Some typed, others scribbled in loopy penmanship or jagged block letters. This is a neighborhood, not a barn. Your job doesn't make you special. Kids play here. You want them catching bird flu? At first, I tried to laugh them off, but when I got one tucked into the windshield wiper of my state-issued vehicle, I knew this wasn't just about eggs anymore. I reported it to the HOA. I wrote a formal complaint. Karen replied, 2 sentences, typed and cold. We have no control over anonymous community correspondence. We recommend contacting the local police if you feel unsafe. But I didn't feel unsafe. I felt hunted. The second board meeting came and went without a vote. Karen had added 3 new items to the agenda, all related to landscaping violations and trash bin placement. My issue never made it onto the list, but I noticed Lydia slip a thin manila folder into Karen's bag afterward. She didn't open it, just nodded. That week, a code enforcement officer showed up at my property. He knocked politely and looked uncomfortable, like someone who had been sent into a room he didn't want to be in. "Sorry to bother you, ma'am," he said. "We got an anonymous tip. Said you were running an unlicensed farm operation on a residential lot." I raised an eyebrow. "A farm?" He shrugged. "I know. Doesn't look like one. I just had to check off some boxes." I led him around the yard, showed him the coop, the garden, the compost. He snapped a few photos. When he saw the binder of documentation I kept in the kitchen drawer, licenses, inspection logs, water testing, he whistled. "You run a tighter ship than most of the actual farms I inspect." "Because I knew someone would try this," I replied. He gave a sheepish smile and left. I never heard back. But the message had been sent. Karen wasn't using the rules. She was using the idea of the rules. Just enough pressure, just enough suggestion to make people doubt, to make neighbors hesitate when waving, to make me feel like I didn't belong. And it worked. That month, I stopped being invited to the weekend potlucks. I'd see gatherings from my window, same gazebo, same folding tables, but no text messages, no emails. I showed up once anyway, carton of eggs in hand. No one was overtly rude, but no one took the eggs. One woman pretended not to see me and turned away mid-conversation. I ate 2 cookies and left early. Even Mr. Pritchard, who used to chat coy techniques over the fence line, stopped coming out. One day I caught his wife staring at my yard from their upstairs window. She ducked as soon as I looked up. It's not that people were bad, they were scared. Karen had a way of making you believe she was the rules, that upsetting her was like upsetting the system itself. And she had bigger plans. A friend of mine who worked in county planning called me one evening, off the record. "Your HOA submitted a zoning variance request last week." My pulse spiked. For what? A development overlay. They're trying to reclassify 2 cul-de-sacs for potential subdivision. That didn't make sense, unless... I pulled up the public records. The overlay included my street. My lot was marked as a potential consolidation parcel. According to the proposal, my house, along with 2 others, was underutilized and might be subject to buyout recommendations if community expansion is approved. Buyout. Eviction. So that was it. Karen didn't just want my hens gone, she wanted the whole street rezoned. More homes, more fees, more control, and my backyard paradise didn't fit her blueprint. I printed the variance application, highlighted every clause. I spent the next 3 nights building a comprehensive rebuttal, citing state code, property rights statutes, and precedent cases on misuse of HOA influence. I prepared a presentation. The zoning board meeting was scheduled for April 17th. I was ready. But Karen wasn't done twisting the knife. 2 days before the hearing, I got a letter. This time, it wasn't anonymous. It was from Pine Ridge Realty LLC, a development company. The letter expressed interest in acquiring the property at 38 Sycamore Lane as part of a community revitalization initiative and included a cash offer well below market value. It wasn't even signed by a broker. It was signed by Mark Thompson, Karen's quiet little board ally. He was on their advisory board. I looked it up. So now it was official, they were trying to push me out. I laughed when I saw the offer. I laughed harder when I pulled out a red pen and wrote "declined" across the page in bold letters. Then I stapled it to the front of my zoning rebuttal. At the hearing, I sat in front of a room full of city officials, most of whom knew me professionally. I laid out every move Karen and her cronies had made, every twisted bylaw, every anonymous complaint, every pressure point. I presented it calmly, rationally, like a woman who was tired, but not broken. When I finished, I said, "This isn't just about chickens, it's about community integrity. The moment HOAs become tools for personal enrichment instead of stewardship, they betray the very people they claim to represent." The board voted unanimously to reject the variance. Karen was not in the room, but I knew she'd feel the loss, and she'd come back harder, because people, like her, don't know how to retreat. They only know how to retaliate. Act 4. The hidden power. They only know how to retaliate. That's what I told myself the night after the zoning board rejected Karen's development scheme. I had won the round, yes, but I also knew how these things worked. I'd sat on too many regulatory review panels, heard too many soft-spoken real estate lawyers try to bend ordinances like straw. People like Karen don't take no as a defeat. They treat it as a delay. So I didn't relax. I got strategic. Up until now, I'd played by the book, responded to notices, attended meetings, gave speeches with footnotes and folders. But it was time I started asking, what was behind the curtain? What did Karen really have to lose? I began with Mark Thompson. The man who offered to buy my house for pennies on the dollar wasn't just a loyal vote on the HOA board. He was also listed as a community development liaison for Pine Ridge Realty LLC, the firm attached to the rezoning application. A little digging into the county public records system showed he'd co-signed on 3 buyout offers to residents in other HOA-run neighborhoods nearby. 2 were successful. One involved an elderly couple whose backyard faced an undeveloped wooded lot, now cleared, paved, and replaced with 5 luxury garden townhomes. HOA dues had tripled, so had property tax. Next, I checked campaign donation records. Karen Hollis had donated over $5,000 to a county council candidate known for pushing accelerated development permits more than anyone else in our entire subdivision. That candidate was the same one who pushed the variance vote onto the April agenda, without any resident petition. That wasn't coincidence, that was coordination. But it wasn't until I turned back to the HOA's financials that I found the key. By state law, HOAs must file an annual report outlining budgets, reserves, and major expenses. It's rarely detailed, usually just line items and vague categories, but I had access to something else. A compliance audit from 3 years ago when Stony Brook Commons failed to file renewal on time. Buried in the state archive, I found it, a single line item that caught my eye. Consulting services, $18,500, Pine Ridge Holdings, unitemized. The same year Karen became president. There it was, the thread. And now I was ready to pull it. I called in a favor. Alex, a colleague at the Department of Agriculture, moonlighted in rural legal consulting and document tracing. I asked him to run the Pine Ridge LLC filings through the state's business registry and look for common agents, co-owners, or P.O. boxes used in other filings. He got back to me the next morning. Karen's husband is listed as the registered agent for one of Pine Ridge's shell entities, CRH Property Solutions. It's the same address as her HOA contact info. The ethics violations alone were staggering. If an HOA president is financially connected to a firm that benefits from zoning changes, property turnover, or HOA enforcement actions and doesn't disclose it, that's not just unethical, it's illegal. I didn't sleep much that week. My nights were spent compiling a report, a dossier really. I titled it Manipulation of HOA Authority for Private Gain, a case study in Stony Brook Commons. Inside, I detailed timeline of HOA notices and anonymous letters, property buyout attempts with financial links to Karen's allies, illegal rezoning proposals, undisclosed business connections, state code violations related to non-disclosure and conflict of interest. And I had something else too, video. Remember those security cameras I'd install? And after the firecracker scare, turns out they'd picked up more than kids. 3 nights earlier, someone had slipped through the side gate, walked straight to my coop, and poured something over the fence. The footage showed a woman with a slim build wearing a hoodie and gloves. She never looked up. but as she turned to leave, her silhouette caught the porch light just long enough to reveal a glint, a pendant. The same silver bird pendant Karen wore to every HOA meeting. I'd filed a police report the next morning after finding what looked like bleach stains in the mulch. The hens were safe, thankfully they'd been locked in their upper roost, but the intent was clear. This had gone from manipulation to sabotage. I scheduled a meeting with the State Ethics Commission, submitted the full dossier, and formally requested an investigation into Karen Hollis, Mark Thompson, and their connections to Pine Ridge and CRH Solutions. I also filed a copy with the Attorney General's office, citing abuse of nonprofit board authority under Delaware state law. Then I sent one more copy, printed, bound, and marked confidential, to each member of the HOA board. I attached a handwritten note. If you still think this is about chickens, you haven't been paying attention. The fallout came faster than I expected. The next morning, Lydia Crane knocked on my door. She looked tired, no clipboard, no blazer, no performance. I had no idea, she said quietly. She handed me a sealed envelope. Inside was a letter of resignation from Mark Thompson. That afternoon, HOA board members called an emergency meeting. Karen didn't show. Word spread. Neighbors started knocking on my door for a change. Mr. Pritchard brought over koi food and asked if I needed help reinforcing the coop fence. The woman who'd ignored me at the potluck apologized and offered to install motion lights. By the end of the week, the HOA email list lit up with residents calling for a vote to remove Karen Hollis as board president. Her house went up for sale 10 days later. No open house, no goodbye. She left the way she ruled, quietly, without grace, behind closed blinds. I stood in my yard the next morning with a fresh cup of coffee and watched Ruby peck the soil with her usual confidence. It had taken months, too many sleepless nights, too many sideways looks, but the tide had finally turned. I hadn't just saved my hens. I'd taken down a bully with a power complex and a fake smile, not because I wanted revenge, but because peace, true peace, is worth fighting for. And because people like Karen count on the rest of us staying quiet. Not this time. Not ever again. Act 5. Public showdown. Peace is worth fighting for. But peace doesn't return by itself. It has to be reclaimed, publicly, visibly, undeniably. And so, 2 weeks after Karen's sudden disappearance from the HOA meeting and her for sale sign quietly rising from her manicured lawn, we held the most crowded HOA assembly in the history of Stony Brook Commons. May 3rd. It was the first truly warm evening of spring, and the air buzzed not with bees, but tension. People who hadn't shown up to a board meeting in years filed into the clubhouse. Some stood along the back wall, others leaned in doorways, arms folded. The folding chairs filled quickly. Even the neighborhood teens, usually bored or glued to their phones, gathered near the windows. Everyone sensed it. Tonight wasn't about trash can violations or power washing sidewalks. Tonight was about truth. The board sat at the front table, reduced. Now to Lydia, a soft-spoken neighbor named Ron, and a newer member named Celine, who ran the community garden club. The seats where Karen and Mark Thompson once presided sat empty, uncomfortably empty. At precisely 6:00 p.m., Lydia called the meeting to order. She began with a prepared statement, her hands trembling slightly as she unfolded the page. As most of you know, recent events have forced us to reevaluate the ethical structure and direction of this board. We acknowledge that certain actions taken under the guise of neighborhood improvement were in fact conflicts of interest executed without proper disclosure or consent from residents. Murmurs rippled through the room. Lydia continued, her voice steadier now. Thanks to documentation provided by Lena Matthews and her team, and confirmed by outside counsel, we have uncovered a pattern of abuse related to land use manipulation, intimidation tactics, and financial benefit tied to members of this board and outside developers. These actions violated both HOA policy and state law. She paused. Effective immediately, a special election will be held to fill the 2 vacant board seats, and all proposed zoning overlays are permanently withdrawn. The room burst into low gasps, mutters, even a few scattered claps. Then someone from the back, an older man I didn't know well, stood and asked what everyone was thinking. "But where's Karen?" Lydia exchanged glances with Ron. "Ms. Hollis resigned from her position via email last night. No further communication has been received." Of course she had. Karen always knew when the performance was over. But her resignation wasn't enough. Not for the people who'd been caught in her wake, who'd watched their community turn cold and suspicious because of her whispers, who'd questioned neighbors and friendships because of her hidden ambitions. They needed something more. I stood up. Everyone turned. I hadn't planned on speaking, but sometimes justice isn't complete until it's spoken aloud. I stepped toward the front and asked for the floor. Lydia nodded, stepping back. Some of you know me as the woman with the chickens, I began. Some of you, for the past 6 months, have known me as a problem, a rule breaker, someone who was hurting property values. I paused, met their eyes. What most of you didn't know, because I never made it the centerpiece of my life, is that I'm also the director of agricultural licensing for the state of Delaware. I help write the very policies Karen tried to twist. A few jaws dropped, some widened eyes. But I didn't come here to talk about my job. I came here to talk about ours. Our job as a neighborhood, as neighbors. Karen manipulated the language of community to serve herself. She used rules as weapons, turned concern into compliance, and built a power structure that rewarded silence and punished curiosity. I raised the manila folder in my hand. This is the proof. This is the paper trail of what she did. How she worked with developers, targeted specific properties, silenced opposition, and disguised it as aesthetic enforcement. I looked out over the crowd, faces I'd once barbecued beside, traded tomatoes with, helped jumpstart cars in the winter. If she came after me, she'll come after someone else in her next neighborhood, because power, once tasted, doesn't go away, it just changes zip codes. I took a breath, my voice quieter now. But here, we stop that cycle. We remember who we are. We write bylaws that actually reflect this place, not just control it. We make the HOA a steward of community, not an instrument of fear. Silence settled. The good kind. Then someone clapped. Then another. And soon the whole room filled with that slow, determined applause, the kind that says, "We see you now." The next week, we held the specie election. Lydia stepped down, and I was unanimously voted in as HOA president, not because I asked to be, but because people finally understood the need for transparency, accountability, courage. The first vote I led, a resolution to form a community oversight committee made up of rotating residents who would review board decisions and budgetary allocations with full transparency. The second, a bylaw amendment, backyard hens allowed under clear guidelines, up to 4, no roosters, no commercial breeding. The resolution passed 38-2. Ruby, Dot, and Marigold became legal residents of Stony Brook Commons. The third resolution, a permanent policy requiring full conflict of interest disclosures for all board members and affiliated parties. 2 months later, I walked past what used to be Karen's house. It sat vacant, the grass growing a little too long, her flower beds untended. No one seemed to miss her. Someone new would move in eventually, and when they did, they'd be greeted not with suspicion, but with welcome baskets, invitations to the garden walk, and maybe even a carton of eggs. From chickens that were never the problem, because Karen had tried to evict more than hens. She tried to evict truth, community, resilience. But we stayed, and she left. Final act, justice closure, we stayed, and she left. But the story didn't end there, because justice isn't just about removing what's wrong, it's about building what's right in its place. After the final vote, after the HOA reforms, after the long shadows of Karen's rule began to dissolve from the sidewalks of Stony Brook Commons, something strange happened. The neighborhood started to breathe again. It wasn't immediate, it wasn't dramatic, but it was real. You could see it in the little things. Kids playing in front yards again, not just on the sanctioned playground, old neighbors who hadn't spoken in months pausing their lawn work to chat by the mailboxes. Someone started a tool-sharing shed, just a converted potting shack next to the gazebo, but filled with donated rakes, trimmers, head shears, even a leaf blower with a duct-taped handle. The kind of goodwill you can't enforce, only inspire. People began to reclaim ownership of the place, not through control or rules, but through participation. We weren't just residents anymore. We were neighbors again. And me? I kept waking up early, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I'd pour my coffee, step onto the porch, and listen for the soft cluck of contentment from the back corner of the yard. Ruby, Dot, Marigold. Still here, still mine. Ruby started laying again not long after Karen moved. It was strange. I hadn't realized how much tension those birds had absorbed. But animals know. They carry what we won't admit. And when the air cleared, when the noise faded, Ruby returned to her rhythm. One perfect brown egg every other morning. A small, silent gift. I placed her 500th egg in a little ceramic dish on the kitchen windowsill, not to eat, just to remember. Because that egg wasn't about food, it was about everything we kept. July 12th, a date that means nothing on most calendars, but it became a milestone here. That's when the newly formed Community Oversight Committee hosted the first ever Stony Brook Gathering Day. No formal agenda, no dress code, just folding chairs under the oak trees, iced. Tea, picnic blankets, and a potluck table longer than a church pew. We didn't hire a band, didn't rent a bounce house, just played old records through someone's Bluetooth speaker and let the kids run wild. I brought deviled eggs and lemon bars. A woman I barely knew, Janice from Cedar Row, walked up with her own Tupperware of cucumber salad and asked if she could meet the girls. I led her back to the coop. She cried when she saw them. "My grandmother kept hens," she said. "I haven't heard this sound in 30 years. We sat on my back step and just listened for a while. No agenda, no rules, just two women, some chickens, and peace. A few weeks later I got a letter in the mail, this time a real letter, handwritten in blue ink on heavy cream paper. It was from Helen Winslow, a former HOA president from a different community 3 counties over. She'd heard about what happened through mutual connections and wanted to thank me for setting a precedent. Apparently my case had prompted other neighborhoods to start auditing their own boards, re-examining vague bylaws, and questioning leadership that had gone unchallenged for too long. I read the letter 3 times. Then I folded it neatly and placed it beside Ruby's 500th egg. Some victories you frame, others you just hold. Karen never came back. Her house sold quietly to a young couple with 2 toddlers and a golden retriever. They painted the shutters navy blue, replaced her hydrangeas with sunflowers, and built a sandbox in the backyard. Every time I pass by, I smile. There's no bitterness, just closure. Because here's the thing. No one tells you about justice. It doesn't always look like revenge. Sometimes justice is the absence of fear. Sometimes it's a sandbox where there used to be silence. Sometimes it's a hen's cluck at dawn and a neighbor's wave at dusk. Sometimes it's knowing that you stayed, that you stood you had, our ground, that you honored what mattered, even when no one else understood why. The new bylaws passed unanimously in August. We kept them short, clear, written in plain English. No more foggy phrases like aesthetic harmony or unwanted activity, just real definitions, real limits, real protection for people trying to live their lives without harassment. Backyard hens were officially sanctioned. Not grandfathered in, not overlooked, legal, protected, permanent. But we didn't stop there. We added clauses for community gardens, rainwater harvesting, solar panels, beekeeping, small things that bring life to a place, that invite participation instead of fear. And then, at the very bottom, a final line. The purpose of this HOA is to preserve peace, encourage belonging, and ensure equity, not just order. It wasn't poetic, but it was honest. And it meant something. That fall, we harvested over 300 pounds of vegetables from the community plots. We started a composting station behind the tool shed. A 7th grader named Milo launched a newsletter called The Weekly Cluck, complete with coop updates and Hen of the Week spotlights. He asked to interview me for the first issue. I said yes. He asked one question. Why did you fight so hard for chickens? I thought for a long time. Then I said, because they were never just chickens. Karen thought she could force me out with red ink and silence. She thought shame would do what bylaws couldn't. She thought a title, HOA president, meant power. But the truth? Power is what happens when people refuse to disappear. When they stand quietly, confidently, and say, no, this is my home too. They tried to take away 3 hens. What they lost was control. Final call to action. Have you ever had to fight for something small, something others dismissed, but you knew in your bones was worth protecting? Maybe it was your garden, your traditions, your right to live quietly without permission slips from people who don't understand your peace. If so, I'd love to hear your story. Drop a comment below, tell us what you stood up for, and how you found your voice. And if this story reminded you of home, of heritage, or just gave you hope, tap subscribe. There's more where that came from. Because sometimes justice comes with feathers, and sometimes the quietest victories echo the loudest.